So Cynthia is going to be talking about family influences on resilience in children born preterm, and Cynthia has developed quite an expertise in this area. She's worked on several projects involving high-risk kids, including young children with jail parents, young children who are from low-income families, and children who are born preterm, which is what she'll be talking about now. She is a fabulous teacher. She's taught a couple of classes for us in this department, including our class on play, including one of our service learning classes, developmental and family assessment, which she's currently teaching right now. She's also been a teaching assistant. She's, and before that was a lead teacher at Big Oak Child Care Center, so she's even a really good teacher for the little ones, which is very exciting. She has published and co-authored papers in numerous journals, including Developmental Psychology, the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry, Family Relations, and her first authored publication is just coming out in Infant Behavior and Development. She's presented at 10 national and international conferences, and she will be finishing up her Ph.D. in the year to come or so, but in the meantime, she's being productive in another way. With her baby due in December. So please welcome Cynthia Burnson.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks everyone for coming up on this snowy day, the first one really of the season. So today I'm going to be talking about family influences on resilience in children born preterm. So I've got kind of two main areas I want to cover today. One is one specific paper that we've been working on is under review on this topic, but then also just on resilience in general. So I find it a really fascinating area, and a lot of people who work in any type of risk, I think, can really be thinking about this as a useful model. So I'm going to talk a little bit about resilience models, sort of the background, what kind of the current state of the research is, how to go about a resilience analysis. So there's a lot of kind of different ways to go with that. Then a little bit of background on children born preterm, which is the specific risk context that I'll be talking about today. And then go into detail on this one paper, Risk and Resilience in Children Born Preterm at age 6. And then at the end, I was hoping to get more into a discussion about some of the issues involved in using a resilience framework for looking at various types of research. So I've got some kind of areas that are important to think about when attempting to do a resilience analysis in an area. Okay, so the resilience definition has really evolved over time. It started, like most areas of research, has started pretty simple and has more recently come to this more nuanced view. And so we can think of resilience as a dynamic developmental process accompanying the attainment of positive adaptation within the context of significant adversity. So some of these are really important issues here. One is, this is a more recent definition, so we see that as a dynamic developmental process, and we'll talk about that a little later on as opposed to like a trait. Also, we're looking at some type of positive adaptation, and the way you can conceptualize that is very diverse, and we'll talk about that again a little bit later. And then a key part that sometimes get lost is that it has to be in the context of significant adversity. So we're talking about some type of risk situation here. And so that's a really important part of resilience, is that this is work that's being done in the context of risk where we might not expect development to be unfolding in an adaptive way. Historically, this area of research was a reaction to a focus on psychopathology. So developmentalists and psychologists, of course, for forever have been interested in when things go wrong, what's happening with high rates of clinical depression or schizophrenia or all kinds of different areas. But one thing that researchers started to notice was that even under conditions of high risk, some people were doing pretty well. And so resilience came out of that, the focus on psychopathology, and they wanted to expand that and start looking at what's going on when development is actually going quite well even in these contexts of high risk. So what supports resilience processes? Taken together, looking at the big area of research in this area, what we see are at different levels. At the child and individual level, we see things like cognitive skills, self-regulation, self-efficacy, more things that we would consider sort of the individual level are the types of things that have been shown to promote resilience processes. At the family level, we see things like secure attachment, effective parenting. These are really important adaptive systems that are going to help kids, even when they're in a high context of risk, achieve these positive adaptive responses. And then, of course, at context level, we see things like socioeconomic status, community support, and so this should feel a little familiar, right? We're starting at an individual, we're moving out in these familiar concentric circles that you might have heard of, and we're seeing resilience operating, these processes operating at multiple ecologies. So when you would like to attempt a resilience analysis, you have to think of some real specific questions. The first is, what is the risk, or what are the risks? So this is a crucial step. This is what differentiates a resilience analysis from, say, like a strengths-based or something, or not a deficit-based or something like that. We really need to be looking at some context of risk. Then the second question you need to ask yourself is, what is the protective factor, or what are the protective factors? What do we think is going to mitigate that risk in order to facilitate a resilient outcome? And then finally, you have to think about what might count as competence. And this is a huge area that we'll talk about a little later after I talk about the paper. But is competence a lack of psychopathology? Or is it the achievement of well-being? If so, in what way? And so these are kind of big, they're both measurement issues, but they're also philosophical issues. And then we also need to think about how are we going to measure these things. So here's kind of, for those of us who are more visually minded, here's what to think about when we think about a resilience analysis. We have some type of area of risk. And then some type of context where we would think that perhaps development is not going to proceed in an adaptive or a protective sort of way. So that's step one. Step two, we need to think about what might these protective factors be. What are the specific things that are going to be that will help children or individuals achieve adaptive functioning? And then finally, we think about what kind of area of competence are we interested in examining. So that's all that goes in the resilience analysis. And we'll come back to that a little bit. Another important decision that needs to be made when we're doing a resilience analysis is whether we want to do a variable-centered resilience analysis or a person-centered resilience analysis. And so these are kind of like the two basic types that you might want to approach. So person-centered, we would think, are there some individuals performing well despite adversity, and what differentiates them from those not doing as well? So these are the very early resilience analyses especially took this a tactic, and so you take a look at actual human beings and you look to see who is doing really well, even in this context of risk, who is not doing so well, and what's different about them. And the advantage of looking at this is that you know that those constellation of attributes are happening in real life. So when you do a variable-centered analysis, this is more kind of what a lot of us are familiar with in terms of research in general, is what variables predict adaptive functioning. So secure attachment might lead to fewer behavior problems down the road. But are there actually children with secure attachment in this context of risk who are achieving these adaptive outcomes? That's something we would look at in a person-centered approach. Are there any questions on that? It's a little technical. Okay. Great, so and some papers have done a nice job of including both of these. The paper I'm going to present today is a person-centered analysis, so we'll walk through that a little more in a moment. Okay, so historically, I think it's just interesting to get a sense of how this has been used in the past. And so there's a huge area, but I'll just kind of go over a couple of interesting directions that this has taken. So some of the earlier studies have been like the Warner and Smith, the classic Hawaiian studies, where a group of children who are considered very high risk due to a variety of socioeconomic factors, growing up in families with various maladaptive patterns, alcoholism and things like that, they experienced multiple risks. And the resilient children had better cognitive test scores, more parenting resources, more positive self-perceptions. So we can see what's happening here. Kids are having both sort of individual level resilience processes, but also family level ones like through parenting resources and things like that. So this is an example of a person-centered analysis where they took a sample of children, followed them for many, many years. They were all in a risk situation, and then took a look at what children were doing really well as they got older, and then started looking at all these different potential protective factors to see why is it that these children are doing well and these children are not doing as well. So this was a big progenitor of resilience analyses early on. More recently, Maston and colleagues in Minnesota have been doing a lot of work with homeless children in the Twin Cities areas. And so the first they identified the fact that children who are homeless face a lot of risks and were not showing a lot of adaptive outcomes, but then upon looking deeper, some of the children were actually doing quite well despite that risk. Some of the kids were not doing as well. So looking at this variability, they really wanted to find out, okay, well, what is it that is different about the kids who are doing well? And some of the things that they found, again, parenting efficacy and executive functioning skills that are important to academic functioning. So when they saw the kids doing well, the types of things that separated the children doing well from the children not doing well tended to be things like more parenting resources, such as parenting efficacy, and also some more of these self-regulation skills. So we're starting to see sort of a theme. We see family-level processes really promoting this resilience, so things like parenting resources, and also some child-level things that are, of course, affected by family influences, such as executive functioning and self-regulation. There's also been some really fascinating work recently done with an international focus. And so one area, I mean there's many, many areas, but one area that's been really fascinating has been former child soldiers. And looking at, I mean, you know, here we would look at like homeless children or children born preterm, and that's a risk, but being a child soldier is like a whole new level of risk. You know, this is a really, really, really dire situation. And so we have children who are serving as 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds in the military, and we would imagine through the trauma of that experience that all of these children would be doing very, very poorly in adolescence. But in fact, we still see a lot of variability in functioning. And so there's been some work done in Uganda and Colombia, Sierra Leone, and many different places. And in some of these areas, some of this research has been showing that about a third were demonstrating a lack of PTSD, and a lack of clinical behavior problems. Now that might not be the same rubric or the same standard that we would hold children in a different risk situation to. Not having PTSD might not be much of an accomplishment for certain risk factors or risk situations, but in the sense of being a child soldier, not having developed symptoms of PTSD and not having developed clinical behavior problems is actually quite remarkable. And then again, we're seeing protective factors coming from all levels of social ecology. So again, individual type level factors, and then all the way out to community support is where we're seeing those resilience processes coming from. Okay, switching gears a little bit, I'm going to go over to the children born preterm and the work that we're doing in here. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background in case this is not your area. Children born preterm, a little over 1 in 10 infants are born preterm, which is less than 37 weeks gestation in the United States. And we've come so far on reducing infant mortality and saving children at earlier and earlier gestation, but we're still seeing a lot of levels of problems, of morbidities, of behavior problems and things like that. So there's still high rates of poor outcomes, but what's really important about this risk situation is that we're still seeing huge variability. And so what does that mean? It means it's ripe for resilience analysis, because we know that not all children born preterm are doing poorly, although a lot are. And so it behooves us, especially in an intervention way, to start looking at what's different about the kids who are doing well versus the kids who are not doing as well. So we know that some preterm infants don't develop significant problems. So the question becomes, why not? And what is going on there that we could potentially carry over to the children who are not doing so well to help them as well? So some of the areas you can see here, we have this boy resisting his marshmallow. He's not enjoying the resistance very much, but it's an important skill, as we all know. So some of the areas that we see in children born preterm that are difficult for them: cognitive functioning, academic outcomes, behavior problems, high levels of ADHD, self-regulation, and sleep quality. And so you can see there's kind of a theme here, and sort of what do all these difficulties or poor outcomes kind of have in common? Does anyone have any thoughts on that? What does this constellation sort of seem to revolve around? So, right, so what we see here is kind of a regulatory theme, right? Is that we have academic outcomes. What do you need to be able to do in school? You need to be able to, be somewhat compliant, sit still, pay attention, things like that. A lot of kindergarten teachers, if you ask them what is the #1 most important skill, it's not knowing all your letters, it's knowing how to sit still and listen to directions a little bit. Behavior problems, ADHD, self-regulation, all the way down to sleep quality. What we really see is a regulatory issue, and some researchers have theorized that most of the issues or risks experienced by children born preterm can actually be traced to some type of regulatory issue. Now, this isn't going to be a paper on the neurobiological substrates of that, but there's a lot of work being done in that area. So resilience, like I said, this is a really ripe area for looking at it in a resilience framework. And so what differentiates those who do well from those with challenges? Once again, we can think about these ecologies of potential protective factors. And first we might think about medical or biological risks. So things that are happening in the NICU, things that are happening prenatally, what kind of are we looking at from sort of a medical or a neurobiological perspective? Socioeconomic context, family influences, and child characteristics. And of course we know that especially these latter three have been seen in the research that we talked about earlier in resilience, have been seen over and over and over and over again as potential sources of resilience and protective factors for children in other types of risk situations. The medical and biological risks can be a bit unique to this population because it has sort of a medical place that it begins. And so, of course, getting to know what these are is really important for intervention design. So what can we do? What is modifiable? What can we do to help families, pediatricians, doctors, other service providers help promote these protective factors to help children with some of these issues that they're having problems with. So when we want to decide what type of competent functioning we're looking at, we wouldn't look probably in this population at lack of PTSD, right? That might not be an area of competent functioning that we're particularly interested in because of the nature of the risk of this sample. And so for children born preterm, what we want to look at is where have they been seen to be having issues? Where have they been seen to be having deficits compared to children born at term? And like I mentioned, we have these types of things, so that's where we want to put our definition of competence so that it matches the risk sample. So it might be determined both by areas where we see deficits on average when compared with children not born preterm, but then also we're all developmentalists. We want to look at competence in a developmentally salient way. So what is important for a child of a certain age to achieve in our culture and in our context that would be defined as competent functioning. And so, if we're going to look at 6-year-olds, which we'll talk about in a moment, we might want to look at things like entry to school issues, how are they doing at school, academic functioning, attention issues, things like that are really a major task of that time period for children developmentally. So for example, a few ADHD symptoms or low behavior problems may indicate positive adaptation in this particular sample. That might not be something we would be interested in another type of risk scenario, but in children born preterm, this is really would mean a lot to see very few ADHD symptoms or low behavior problems. So back to our visual friend here, we're going to look at risk, protective factors, and competence, just to give you a setup for where this paper is going. And I just wanted to kind of review that because I'm going to come back to it and show what we're sort of choosing for each one of these areas in the analysis that we do in our paper. Okay, so the paper, Risk and Resilience in Children Born Preterm at age 6, it's under review right now at Development and Psychopathology. Research is done at the Weizmann Center, all our wonderful co-authors. And so this is the work that I'm going to be presenting today. Okay, so risk. Prematurity, we know, is associated with poor developmental outcomes, which I discussed earlier, especially in an attentional or regulatory fashion. The protective factors that we want to look at are family influences, child characteristics, and then also a little bit of that context. So once again, looking at these individual level things, but also family level and a little bit of the sort of social ecology. And then competence, we wanted to look at skills that were important for school and social success, because that's what's developmentally salient, and that's also what's appropriate to the risk context. And then we're going to be doing a person-centered resilience analysis. So one thing that this paper really came out of is that there's been a lot of research on children born preterm with a children born preterm group and then a comparison group of children born at term. And basically the point is to document all the ways in which children born preterm are falling short. And that has been an extensive literature, and we feel really pretty good that we know all these very many areas where children born preterm are not looking so hot. So now it's time to move on to a within group design and start looking at what is it that's predicting the variability within that group. If we've already established this risk factor, we've already established these deficits, in order to actually go to the next step and help these kids and help these families, we really need to start looking at what we can do, what's modifiable within children born preterm. So we have two main hypotheses. The first one, can one identify a group of preterm children to exhibit positive adaptation across multiple developmental domains at age 6, despite risks associated with prematurity? And so first we just want to know, are there children doing well across multiple domains who are born preterm? That's the hypothesis number one. And the domains we were interested in, these developmentally salient areas, include learning, executive functioning, effortful control, ADHD symptoms, internalizing and externalizing behavior problems, sleep quality, social activities, and peer relations. And you can see that this has quite a lot of overlap with what we know that these children are struggling with to begin with. Hypothesis 2 is, do early child and family factors, including neonatal risk level, early cognitive skills, ability to delay as a toddler, observed parenting quality, and socioeconomic assets, predict which preterm children are resilient at age 6? So put in a non-hypothesis-y kind of way, what we want to know is, if we do in fact identify groups of children who are functioning really well across multiple domains, what's different about them than the children who are not doing so well in those areas? And so because of earlier research in both resilience and also in children born preterm, we're thinking that it's going to be things at those multiple levels that we talked about. So things like neonatal risk level, birth weight, gestational age, some other medical indicators, early cognitive skills, ability to delay. So I had the marshmallow picture up earlier. So can a child delay their gratification in a laboratory task early on? Is that going to differentiate them from children who are not doing as well later on? And then also observed parenting quality and socioeconomic assets. So we're really looking at multiple levels of ecology here. We want to know what's different about the kids that are doing well, if we can in fact identify some, and we think that it might be some of these things. Okay, so again, for the visually minded, we'll just go over it in a non-bullet point and more visual sort of way. Positive adaptation is one of the 3 things that you have to think about when doing a resilience analysis. And what we think positive adaptation would look like for a 6-year-old child who was born preterm would include all of these different things. And we would want to see pretty good functioning in all of these domains to call this child resilient. And then the second part of it is that once we've identified a positive adaptation group or a resilient group, we think that things like early cognitive skills, neonatal health risks, socioeconomic assets, ability to delay, and parenting quality might predict membership in that group. So those are the 2 hypotheses in pictorial form. Okay, so just to get to the methods a little, and if you have any questions about this later, I'm happy to answer any, but you know, it's a large study with a lot of moving parts, so I'm just going to go over the basics here. The sample is 173 preterm infants and their mothers, and we included data for this paper from 5 different time points just prior to the infant's neonatal intensive care unit discharge. So right there in the hospital, 9 months, 16 months, 24 months, and 6 years of age. Some of them corrected for prematurity. Okay, so here are the different assessments we did, and I'll just kind of go over these chronologically. So back at the NICU discharge, does this work? So we have the neonatal intensive care unit, and what we collected here is socioeconomic assets, so maternal education, income, and age, and we sort of created an asset index from those 3 things. We also collected those at later time points, but they're very, very highly correlated, and so we just used this one at NICU discharge. And then also neonatal health risks. So these are things that we get from the medical charts, birth weight, gestational age, and various medical complications. At 9 months, we go into the home and we videotape the mother playing with the child, and we, for about 5 minutes, a free play type of episode, and we code it using the parent-child early relational assessment. So this is a very comprehensive, broad-ranging coding system that looks at things like sensitivity and hostility and intrusiveness and scaffolding and all kinds of ways that the mother is interacting with this child. And I can answer more detailed questions about that if you'd like. We also did the same thing at 16 months of age, and this was at the laboratory, and then also did an assessment of child's early cognitive skills using the Bailey. At 24 months, we administered the ability to delay task, a snack delay. This is part of the effortful control battery, but we're just using one sort of index task from this. And then at 6 years, we have a lot of maternal report. And so we have, this is kind of where we're looking at that positive adaptation. That's where all this information is coming from, is from the 6-year time point. And so we have the child behavior checklist to get at internalizing and externalizing behavior problems, social activities and learning, things like that. Using the Connors to also get at learning, peer relations, ADHD symptoms, and executive functioning. The child behavior questionnaire is a temperament measure, and one of the scales that we used for this paper is effortful control, and then the child sleep habits questionnaire to get at a measure of sleep quality. And so there was some sort of data reduction and ways that we sort of combined these and set them up so that they sort of equally represented those multiple domains of competence that we were looking at. That's where that information came from. So we did a latent profile analysis, and what came out of that was sort of 3 groups emerged, and we labeled them resilient, meaning we thought they were doing quite well across these domains, given their risk status, an at-risk status group, and then sort of a having difficulties group. And I'll show you a graph and where these are, what these are looking like in a moment. So resilient children displayed the most positive adaptation in all domains, followed by at-risk, followed by having difficulties. So what was interesting about this to us was that we were seeing kids, even in different sort of developmental areas, like learning or peer relations or sleep quality, we were seeing if they were performing well in one, we were seeing competence across domains. And so here's what we're looking at here. And so I'll just go through this. So it's important to note, it looks like everything flips here, but what we have here are sort of the positive indices over here, and we have sort of the negative indices over here, right? So being high on learning, effortful control, social peers, and sleep quality are all sort of adaptive things, being high on that. But being high on externalizing behavior problems, internalizing behavior problems, ADHD symptomology, and problems with the executive functioning, high is seen as maladaptive, just to give you some context for this graph. So we have about 30% children in the sample looking resilient. So they're doing well on these positive indices, and they're also doing well on these negative indices. They have low behavior problems and higher functioning in these positive areas. The middle group, the largest group in our study, 57%, were sort of the at-risk ones, and they were looking sort of in the middle here. And then the having difficulties group was about 12.5%, and they're really struggling. They're seeing very low scores on learning and effortful control and all of these things, and then quite high levels of behavior problems, ADHD symptoms, and problems with executive functioning. So do you have any questions on this graph? This is kind of a key.
Do you know if the same 1/3 applies to non-preterm, just children at the age of 6? What the variability is among...
Yes, yeah, good question. So would we see, if we did this with children born at term, would we see this kind of same breakdown? And the answer is no. I don't focus a lot in this talk about it, but we're seeing quite high levels of ADHD and behavior problems in children born preterm compared to like a more normative samples, much higher.
One more question?
Yeah.
You proposed early on that all these dependent variables might be part of sort of a global factor of regulatory ability. And we often have this problem of asking ourselves, are we better off treating each of these dependent variables separately, or are we better off combining them into a very strong global factor? Did you ask that question, and how did you answer it?
Good question. I wouldn't say that I would think of these all as the same factor. I would just say that it's tantalizing that they might have the same substrate. Does that make sense? So it's more like we're seeing challenges and difficulties developmentally in multiple domains that I think are distinct from one another. So like sleep habits being distinct from peer relations, being distinct from learning and effortful control and things like that. Just that in the etiology of developing these issues, some researchers looking at children born preterm think that perhaps it has an early regulatory component to it. Does that make more sense? Not so much that they are all indices of regulation, just that that might be the common thread to where that's starting.
But it does seem like there's a positive correlation between all of these factors. Any guess about how high that correlation would be?
Between all of these different factors, looking at them separately?
The correlation matrix of all of them, you'd have about 50 correlations. And I'm just curious if you know about what the average correlation is between each of them.
Yeah, no, I don't.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a follow-up question on that because that's a really good point. And so it's known that you can do you're using continuous variables, so you can do a factor analysis on this type of data. And it looks to me by the graph that you have two continuous factors. You have people that are high, low, and medium on these two factors, but it's just flipped. So. I mean, is there a reason why, this may be a better way of looking at it compared to just a traditional, factor analysis?
I think that most of the reason would be conceptual. And so one thing we really want to know is, from a conceptual standpoint, we're looking at functioning in a lot of different domains, and even if they are highly correlated, that's sort of an empirical question, right? And so I think that, let me think about it for a minute here. Because we have information on so many different domains of development, I think it was really important to look at them separately just to see if that's in fact what was going on. And we didn't want to a priori look at sort of a collapsed factor that might not have that theoretical support. So is it true in children born preterm that getting along better with your peers means you sleep better at night? Well, I'm not sure that I could really justify that. And what we really wanted to know was, is there high functioning on all these multiple domains? Not from like a correlation or statistical standpoint, but more from a conceptual one.
Well, I'm just wondering, because it does, like I mentioned, it does look like there's two factors there. Is there any, if you look at the difference, like it would be sleep, peers, social, efforts, control, and learning at one of them, and then externalizing, internalizing the behavior and the rest on the other one. Is there any theoretical rationale for why those?
Well, these are just like coded different. That's why it's flipped. Is that what you're asking?
Are there any, theoretical reasons why those variables would load on that factor? I don't know the research background.
Well, if you were to recode these so that they were flipped, we would be looking at 3 parallel lines.
Yeah, there's really just one factor, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
If you were thinking about it, right. So if you wanted to if you wanted to look at it, if you really wanted to reduce the data and maybe not have a super useful take-home message on it, you could say that regulation, as defined by these many domains, that people in the field or practitioners they would look at them differently. The sleep habits or externalizing behavior problems or effortful control. But if you wanted to call it regulation, you would have a lot of explaining to do, I think.
While there are strengths to having a factor, I really like that you kept them separate as the first step in this study, because I know exactly what sleep problems means. But you have some global factor, meaning regulation, and it becomes so abstract. And so each of these are very concrete. I like that.
Yeah, so I think that doing a person-centered resilience analysis has kind of gives you a framework for how you want to look at this. And one thing we want to look at is are there actual children who are doing well in all these areas, even though we know children born preterm frequently don't do well in these areas. And this really answers that question, whereas if we collapsed it into just some kids have high regulation, well, what does that really mean from a resilience perspective? Yeah, thanks. Good questions. All right. So to go into the second hypothesis, here's just to remind us what it looks like and what we actually found when we were trying to predict group membership in which, if we want to talk about the technical details of that later, we can, but I won't get into it. But let's just say group membership for now. Here are the things that came out. Parenting quality, higher parenting quality early on at that 9-month and 16-month time period. Predicted membership in the resilient group versus the at-risk and having difficulties group. And we collapsed those two because if you remember, we have a fairly small percentage here in the having difficulty group. So we were curious, what is differentiating the resilient group from the other two groups? So we saw higher parenting quality, so more sensitive parenting, less negative parenting in those early toddler years. Also ability to delay, so that SNAP delay task we talked about at 24 months. And then interestingly, neonatal health risks, and I think this is a fascinating part of how this paper turned out, is that the higher neonatal health risks, the more likely you were to end up in this resilient group. So we'll talk about that in a moment. That's the little plus sign. Denotes. The other two are how you would expect: more ability to delay, higher likelihood of being resilient, and same as parenting quality. So some children born preterm show resilience across multiple developmental domains at age 6. And that was actually a question we wanted to know because it's something that hasn't really been looked at. Are there kids that we can, actual children, not variable associations or interaction effects, but actual children, are some of them doing really well across these multiple domains? And the answer is yes. However, like Libby's question, do we still see a high prevalence of maladaptive outcomes? So it's not like we started looking at this and everyone was doing really well and what a huge surprise. There was still a lot of maladaptive outcomes in terms of, especially in terms of ADHD symptoms and in clinical levels of behavior problems. So we're still seeing a big variability, but upon a closer examination, some of the children are actually doing quite well. And then as per hypothesis 2, we saw that less negative parenting, early ability to delay, and then more neonatal risk predicted resilience. And the neonatal risk finding is really something that bears following up with because we're just being speculative here. And some ideas that we had about why that could be that higher risk infants may receive more interventions early on, and so they're seen as more high risk, they're more identified that way, and therefore they might be receiving more information, or their parents might be expecting more issues, they're sort of more on the alert. Whereas if your child was born at 35 or like 36 or somewhere around in there, or the mid 30 weeks gestation, maybe the message that the families are getting, like, well, there weren't any, you didn't spend a lot of time in the NICU, you're not having a lot of medical complications, things will probably be fine, and then they're sort of still seeing some of these attentional difficulties later on and maybe are not as prepared to deal with them. It's also worth pointing out that the 6-year information we had was maternal report, which is something that we would love, is a limitation, that we would like to see more reports of how the child is doing at age 6. But it also could point to where this finding is coming from, which is we're asking the mother, who of course is aware of the child's preterm history, what the neonatal risks were, and frequently the CBCL and other instruments like that ask things like, how often has this behavior been a problem? Not how often is this behavior occurring? So it has like a little bit of a context to it when the mother's filling that out. And so it could be that the moms with children who are more at risk at birth are less likely to report that something is a problem. So those are just some theories that we're thinking about on that finding. And so a resilience framework is useful when researching children born preterm because it moves us past this deficit-based perspective and a purely comparative perspective. So, we've seen over and over again that children born preterm are not doing as well as children born term. Now what do we do next? We want to look within that group to see what areas of strengths and what areas of resilience that we can build on for all those families, not just a few. A resilience framework also offers valuable information for practitioners and families, and so I think you would be hard-pressed to sit down and say, well, your child might score low on the regulatory factor, which is one of the reasons that we do it this way, is that we want to look at things that really mean things to people. And resilience is a very applied framework, and that's one of its real strengths, is that we can talk about sleep quality, we can talk about peer relations, we can talk about behavior problems, things that make a lot of sense to people. And then we can help identify possible targets for intervention, things like early parenting and effortful control that we know are important for children to develop these regulatory capacities. That's not the conclusion of the talk. That's just the conclusion of the preterm part. So don't get excited. So So now I wanted to talk, one of my favorite things to do is talk a little bit about the theory. And so if you have questions or want to discuss this as it comes up, I'd be happy to, because I find this framework really fascinating. And working with children who are at risk, there's a lot of issues you have to decide on or make judgments on when moving forward with an analysis like this. So using a resilience model, issues and considerations, things that we need to think about and things that we did think about when writing this paper on children born preterm. And so that's sort of, an example of how this can go. So the very first step, if you recall, was looking at risk. What is risk and what does that mean and how do we measure it? And there's a couple different issues we need to think about. One that's really important is a proximal risk versus a distal source of risk. And so one pitfall that resilience research has had is sometimes they take a distal source of risk. So it would be something like, low income or experiencing poverty or something like that, that we're pretty sure has an important effect on children, but through some other more proximal process, right? And so one of the issues that has come up is that sometimes researchers are looking at sort of this easy social address type distal risk, and they're saying, look, all these kids are at risk. But when you look closer, the children who look like they're doing well are actually just experiencing less of the risk. And so it's really important to think carefully about when doing an analysis like this, are the kids looking resilient just because they have less risk than the other kids?
Less distal risk or less proximal?
Less proximal risk, right? So if you start off saying like, I'm just gonna look at a lot of kids with this one index of risk, it might turn out upon closer examination, this has happened in some research areas, that when you look closely, actually some of the kids were not getting as much of that risk as the other kids, and then they were looking better. Does that make sense?
Low income versus like parent quality within low income families.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be a good example of that. So it gets complicated, but that's the general idea, is that if in fact your so-called resilient children just have less risk, is that really resilience, and what does that mean for the research there? Another area has been cumulative risk indices versus one risk factor. So some resilience analyses have been sort of event-based, children who experienced like an earthquake or some kind of like traumatic event, and sort of by virtue of being around for that thing, they're all in the risk group. That would be sort of that type of one risk factor type of thing. But a cumulative risk index would look more at many things piled on top of one another, and things, so like a life events questionnaire or a life events checklist of stressful things that have happened to a child. And one thing that we know is that the more of those someone experiences, the more likely they are to have poor outcomes. So there's sort of two different ways to look at that. So in our study, we looked at the one risk factor was being born preterm. That was like, it's sort of like the main index, and we didn't so much look at the gradients in terms of the risk definition, although of course we did include various levels of neonatal risk and things like that. And then, like I just mentioned, chronic risks versus one-time traumatic events. And so what does it mean for a child to be experiencing high levels of neighborhood violence and poor parenting quality and poor school quality and all these sorts of things wrapped up over many, many, many years versus a one-time traumatic event like an earthquake or something like that. Those are also two different ways to look at research like this. And then, as I mentioned earlier, is the risk associated with adaptive functioning. And so what we would want to see in a resilience analysis is that the risk is something that we know leads to poor outcomes in some way. That's important, because that's what makes the risk worth studying. But then is the risk associated with protective factors, that's more problematic, because if you're less likely to have that protective factor simply by having the risk, then your analysis gets a little muddy. Any comments on those issues there? Okay. So then you have to decide what is competent functioning, and there's a lot that goes into this. This is a really, really important area, and a lot of I alluded to this a lot, talking about how we decided to do those different domains for the children born preterm. There's a lot of different considerations that go into how you're going to decide what competent functioning is. And so the first thing to remember is that this is really culturally determined. And so in the children born preterm study, we're talking about we want kids to be doing well at school, right? We want them to like sit and pay attention and do things like that, and that's a very value-oriented, culturally determined area of competence. We want them to be sleeping well at night. We want them to be getting along with their peers and engaging in social activities. I mean, those are things that can be very culture specific. And if you remember the child soldiers research, what we would want to see there is low levels of PTSD, which is sort of specific to the risk and things like that. So it's important to remember that when you're deciding what competence is, you're making like a cultural value judgment based on what you think it's important for that child or individual or family to be doing at that time in that place. It should be relevant to the risk under study. So we talked about this a lot with the PTSD being especially relevant to child soldiers. Perhaps we would see growing up with a clinically depressed mother, having low levels of depression yourself would be a really salient outcome that would be relevant to the risk under study, but maybe not for another risk area. Developmentally salient as well, we want to make sure that that matches up to sort of what the age-appropriate tasks or mastery that we would want to see developmentally at that area. And then this has varied a lot across different research programs. Is it important to see competence across domains, or can it be just in one domain? Is resilience domain specific, or is it across domains? And what does it mean if you're excelling at school, but you're having really high levels of mental health issues at home? Can you be resilient in sort of one area but not other areas? How many areas do you have to be functioning well in to be considered resilient? These are sort of conceptual questions as well as measurement questions. And so in our study, we talked about being resilient across domains. That was something we were really interested in finding out. Is that something that's even occurring in our sample? And we found that yes, it was. But of course, we could have looked at different domains, or we could have just looked at one of those domains by itself. And I think that for this seminar series, with the well-being theme that we've been talking about all semester here, can a lack of problems count as resilience? And I think this is a really important question, because something that's really happening in psychology and has been for a while is shifting a focus, almost like historically we've shifted from psychopathology to more resilience. We're shifting from just lack of problems to actual well-being, positive functioning, positive psychology, things like that. And one area that's really been under-researched in that is, what does that look like for children? So if children are compliant at school, is that well-being? If they're low on ADHD symptoms, is that well-being? Or is that just a lack of a problem? So it's an interesting issue to think about, because if you sit down to measure well-being in children, it's difficult. There's not a lot of things around to use. We have the child behavior checklist, which is behavior problems. The Conners, similar. I mean, most of those types of measurements have a negative valence to them, and what you end up looking like positive functioning is just lack of negative behavior. So I think that's a real area for growth. And then some measurement issues, how much competence counts. So this is kind of fascinating. So in ours, we did it sort of empirically. We didn't set a cutoff period. Ahead of time, we looked at what was happening within our sample and wanted to see some kids were doing well, some kids were not doing so well, and some kids were really, really not doing so well. But again, it speaks to Libby's question. What does it mean within our sample? How much competence counts as being competent? And so in other areas, they might do things like look at a sample and decide that all the kids who are doing one standard deviation above the average are resilient. But what if that functioning is so much lower than a typically developing population? Should we be calling that resilient? Is it just resilient relative to other children with that same risk? I don't know, it's an interesting question. So, and sometimes they'll just do a above average split out of a clinical range that has a little more of a clinical spin to it. So by not displaying clinical levels of whatever the problem is, now you're resilient. If you're at really, really, really high risk for developing clinical behavior problems, that might be a perfectly reasonable way to look at competent functioning. It's just something to think about. And then there's a lot of sort of bigger issues about resilience in general. And so we know that resilience can occur at multiple levels, the individual, family, and community. So that, of course, makes for very complicated. Anyone who's ever read any bioecological systems theory analyses, it can become a very complicated analysis because you're thinking that all these things are affecting one another. And so by using that framework, you've sort of made an implicit promise to not just look at one level. You need to start looking at a more comprehensive package, which makes for some fairly complicated research. One area that resilience has really changed is this idea of it being a process, a trait, or an outcome. And so sort of initially, and we can see the copy of The Invulnerable Child, and we have this special child here with this aura, the invulnerable child. He has some kind of special trait that makes him invulnerable to all these risks that these other kids they just fell prey to. And so we've really, for the most part, moved past that idea into more of like a process-oriented model and an outcome-oriented model. And then I think a really important area is the danger of blaming the victim in resilience research. And so the idea here is that, well, how come all you kids can't just be like him? You know, maybe we've put you through this horrible risk, or there's unfair, policies, or children are living in poverty, but this kid did great. So obviously the problem is not with the risk, the problem must be with those kids. Yeah.
How do you know they remain resilient? You just measure them at 6 years old, you go on to 7, 8, how do you know, once they get there, it's just a short period of time where they're resilient and they don't fall back?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in addition to wanting to look at across domains or in just one domain is one sort of question you have to make, but then also developmentally what's happening over time. So are kids doing really well at age 6, but then they sort of fall apart when a new developmental challenge comes up? So maybe at adolescence or something like that. And we don't know because we were just looking at that starting off with the age 6 time point, but it would be really important and interesting to look at that functioning over time developmentally, what happens down the road.
Intervene at that age if you got it when they're resilient? Is that,
What's that?
would you could intervene at the age of 6 years old for these other ones? Is that
Well, I think that in this paper, I mean, sorry, tap the microphone. I like to study infants and toddlers, and as far as I'm concerned, 6 is like the end of the that's the end of the road. And so what I think we were looking at is those really early precursors, that early parenting quality, that early self-regulation, that effortful control, even the neonatal health risks, which is not something that would be a good psychological intervention program, right? We're hopefully already doing all we can medically. So right, you would want to look at timing of intervention if you were to move on to the next area of research, which would be an intervention type study. Timing of intervention, targeting those areas that we know increase membership in a resilient group, but then how does that unfold over time and how much support do you need to do? That's a good question. And so I have this quote that I always like to keep in mind when looking at this because people get so excited about all these things that can help kids even when they're in these terrible risky situations do well, but it's important to remember that in the enthusiasm for understanding and promoting resilience, it is important to remember that many sources of threat to child development are preventable and far less costly to prevent than to address once they begin to erode development in the adaptive tools for life. So rather than get too excited about a third of child soldiers not having PTSD, perhaps we could consider not having children be child soldiers at all. And that would be something really important to keep in mind. So of course, we have to balance this. We want to be doing both types of research or both types of inquiry at the same time, is that we already know what these risks are, and preventing them is really, really, really important. But we also know that that can't be done all in one fell swoop, and at the same time, we can be looking at these resilience processes, yeah.
What about addressing resilience skills before any type of erosion of development occurs, before threat comes, like proactively teaching resilience in a kindergarten setting, for instance?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so a lot of programs have come out of this type of theory, and what we would talk about there, it would be a strengths-based approach, right? And so a resilience approach implies and has as a necessary component a risk to it. So we already know that there's a risk happening. And so that's why that wouldn't specifically be a resilience thing, but a strengths-based approach would be to say, what do we know about resilience in a risk setting? We know that early parenting quality and things like that, we would call that a promotive factor. So something that helps everybody do better, regardless of risk status. And then you could implement that early on, assuming that life has challenges and that everyone can benefit from these sort of strengths-based approaches. But the reason it's a little different is because you haven't specifically identified like a risk that you're trying to work on yet. Does that make sense? And so in some areas, some protective factors are more important in a risk condition. So the example that Ann Maston always uses is like an airbag. So you're driving down the road and you get in an accident, but you have an airbag.
Okay, so then there would be different styles of resilience depending on a specific threat then? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
I don't understand your question. Can you say it again?
Increase resilience depending on the risk factor.
Right, so it might become, it's not that important to have an airbag if you're not in an accident.
Right.
And in fact, it could probably be a problem. But if you're specifically experiencing a risk such as a car accident, the airbag is going to be a really big deal. On the other hand, I can't go that far with the car analogy, so I'll just give it up. But on the other hand, there are things that are good for well-being and good for all people regardless of risk factor. Those are promotive. They bring everybody up.
Nutrition.
Good nutrition. Eat your vegetables, yes. Promotive for everybody, and that's not a risk-activated situation.
Right. Okay. I was just basing that question off of the mindfulness research that's going on at Investigating Healthy Minds, introducing mindfulness practices and attention and delayed gratification in kindergartens, and just like what the implication of that might be for preventing the need for, a reactive resilience lesson, I guess.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about because that research is so new in children that it's hard to know. It depends kind of what are you going for like a risk population? Are you going kind of across the board? And are you trying to increase well-being in general in terms of well-being, or are you trying to mitigate poor outcomes?
Right.
Or are you trying to mitigate poor outcomes by increasing well-being? They're all just slightly different looks at the same thing.
Or mitigate the reaction to outcomes, or mitigate the reaction to poor outcomes.
Right, by which you would want to reduce said outcome, probably, right? Yeah, it's interesting because the resilience is the well-being issue versus the lack of problems issue are kind of interesting, the way they play off of one another. But yeah, I think that resilience, especially programmatically, often forgets that the risk is an important part. So it's also kind of a philosophical questions like, is human existence inherently risky? And are you going to someday have a risk that you should probably build up these processes for to begin with? Or are we looking at real specific risks? That makes sense, yeah.
But I think in children born preterm that they're at risk from the time they're born, and so they're already showing attention problems at really early age too. So if you start a kindergarten program, you're already not able to just ignore that risk and those problems that are already there. You probably would have to do something a little bit different. Just a program that's for everyone.
So more like a resilience-oriented one versus like a strengths-based. They're kind of slightly different. Okay. So resilience models, here's why I'm a fan. This is sort of my list of pros for resilience models. So one thing I really like about this approach is that it's well suited for both theoretical questions as well as application. And so you can both think of it from the sort of academic, oh, I wonder, what's going on in this development of this disorder, or I wonder what's going on when children are doing well here, and it's sort of this theoretical kind of question, but then also it's really, really, really useful and translatable to things like interventions and policy immediately. It kind of always ends up with this take-home message right away, which is something I really like about a good resilience analysis. It works well with other theories. So for example, ecological systems, we saw that a lot, looking at resilience processes at various levels of ecology. It works really well with that. Attachment theory comes up a lot, having we see parenting over and over and over again, early parenting quality as a resilience process, so it fits in really easily with things like attachment theory. And it kind of can guide you towards some specific analysis decisions when you're looking at sort of these big, huge theories that have these ideas, but you really want to hone in on a specific question. A resilience framework can really get you that last step. One criticism of a lot of research in this area is the heterogeneity in measurement and in conceptualizations and different things of risk and competence, and we went over kind of all those different issues that there's a million different decisions to make. But actually this heterogeneity can be seen as a strength, especially when we see these convergent findings. And some theorists have argued, yes, we might not have it all down in terms of like, this is exactly how you should proceed with this type of analysis, but look, we still see the same things over and over and over again, even though we're doing them in all these slightly different ways, different populations, different time periods, different measurements. We're still seeing things like early parenting quality, early regulatory skills, as being really convergent findings. So the heterogeneity in analysis plans almost becomes a strength when we see convergent findings like this. And then it moves past a deficit-based perspective, which can provide a distorted view of development and lack of ground for intervention. And so when we think of a risk area, we think, well, all these kids are doing terrible. My hands are tied. But a resilience analysis really looks deeper, looks at the variability in outcomes, and starts to identify really key points for intervention that can be really useful. All right, and those are sort of my thoughts on resilience framework, sort of as they apply to children born preterm as the example research. So does anyone have any questions?
I know that I've read a lot about poverty and children, how successful they are going forward. And I'm curious, as you're looking at those different variables, if you'd ever get to the point where you might say, and I'm just throwing this out, that a greater risk factor than preterm is poverty. A greater risk factor than preterm is lack of attachment with a parent. And I know that's kind of like taking what you're looking at and flipping it, but is that something that, as you're doing your research, you're thinking about, that even though you're using this risk factor of preterm, which risk factor, I hate to put it in terms of which risk factor is the worst?
Is the worst,
you know,
yeah.
Is it being born into poverty? Is it like your child soldiers kind of thing? Or is it the preterm thing? Or anyway, just a question about how you choose what you chose to study.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about, because one is it gets at the issue of a risk index versus a risk, just sort of one static risk factor. And these are sort of research questions that you have to think about. But also, we were interested, and if you remember here, actually didn't find the socioeconomic assets to be predictive of this resilient group. So I think in this study, because there have been a lot of studies on poverty and low-income children or homeless children or things like that, in this particular study, what we're interested in children born preterm precisely because we had a really broad range of socioeconomic assets. So we had kids who were who weren't in poverty, who had a lot of resources and things like that, who are showing these sort of attentional difficulties. And that's kind of interesting. But if you wanted to think more about, you could do a risk index too if you wanted to look at like whether things sort of stack up, and that's something that's been shown in a lot of other research.
And I thought it was interesting that parenting quality, when you go back to that other slide where we have parenting ability, the arrows with just the plus sign.
Oh yeah.
Because I just read a study recently, or a synopsis of it, that they looked at adult men. Half of the participants had been like Harvard or some, elite school, and how successful they were in looking at alcoholism and things like that, like how they developed as an adult. And then the other group of men were people who came out of poverty. And did they become alcoholic, or were they successful? They had different variables. And what they found in that study was it was not at all related to the poverty versus the Harvard, using those two extreme measures, but it was related to parenting quality and the relationship that they had with their own parents. So even if they had grown up in poverty, if they had good parental, that was a positive correlation, then they came out higher on the indices of not alcoholic or more successful in their career or whatever. So I thought that was, that's kind of what I think you're showing here, that parenting quality was a critical element for resilience, and that's basically what that study showed, with a completely different population, no relevance to preterm. So
I'm sure.
The other thing I wanted to tell you about real briefly is, I also just recently read about a 26-year longitudinal study where they looked at strengths, and they looked at 3-year-olds, and then 26 years later, where were they? And the strengths that were identified at the age of 3 we're still the same at 26 years later. So just somebody's question about, with 6 years old, I mean, what that study would tell you is that whatever you are, whatever your strengths are at 3, 4, 5, 6, they're probably still going to be your basic strengths as an adult. So
I'm curious.
those things are formed very, very early on. You're kind of, I mean, not that we can't all improve our education or improve our socioeconomic place in life, but that the skills that we learn very, very early on stay with us for a long time.
Yeah, that's a lot of interest. So what kind of strengths? I'm curious.
Well, this is that whole strengths finder that's by Tom Rath, and I could get you the names of the people that did this study, but they looked at more related to relationships and how you manage in the world, so not like I'm a mathematician, but more like I'm good at organizing things, or I'm good at building new relationships, more of those kinds of strengths.
Yeah, it's interesting. So they're thinking of it more as like a trait type thing.
Right.
That's interesting.
So I had a question about these three, so while we're on the slide, and how either they're, it sort of builds on, but how either they're related, or if they're related, or if you even thought, or if it's just separate things. The high neonatal health risks could lead to resistance, or this, or parent quality.
Right. So in this,
Or if they're related.
right. So in this particular analysis, it's like a regression analysis. So we're hoping that if the statistical gods are smiling on us, that they are partialed out nicely one at a time. But I think that a lot of resilience analyses really, because there's so many, they really point to the importance of having a framework or a theoretical reason for entering things in a certain way, because there are so many ways, right? So a risk could be the neonatal health risk, or like a risk could be, or I'm thinking of in Libby's question, well, if parenting quality differentiated those two groups of men, were the rates of quality parenting different in the two groups? So there's just like a million different ways, but in this particular analysis, these are the precursors we were looking at in a regression, sort of one at a time, predicting membership in this group, rather than sort of their interrelations to one another. Yeah.
Just kind of conceptual question. You and others define resilience as an individual level outcome, adaptation by individual. But I hear people talking about resilient biology, resilient social ecology. Obviously, the process spans all these levels. Is that acceptable to talk about resilience at those levels, or does that muddy the water conceptually for us?
So like a resilient community, or like a resilient organization.
Because those don't fit Chatete's definition.
Oh, right, way at the beginning. Yeah, I'll take a look at that quick. Oh, hang on, it'll be easy to do it here. Yeah, so I think that is a, here we go.
It doesn't say that.
I'm not what's that? Yeah, I'm not sure that it does specify a person, but I think that the attainment of positive adaptation, I mean, that could be organizational.
But that would be a very different kind of study than you did.
Yes, yes, it would.
And so the social ecology predicts better resilience for individuals. That's not a resilient social ecology. But if something else predicts better outcomes for the social ecology, that would be.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was reading something when I was preparing for this, that Ann Maston had taken part in sort of a symposium or a big meeting trying to bring together like biologists and management people and business people and all these to talk about the concept of resilience at all levels, from an organism to a bridge to an HMO to a child. And I don't know what the outcome was of that, but it would be fascinating to read, because of course in my area I'm interested in child outcomes, so an individual level one. And but I don't think that that's constricting to the concept of resilience at all. I think that it can be, it's used in huge areas, organizational resilience and material resilience. engineers. I mean, it's like a pretty broad concept. But one interesting point you brought up is, what if the resilience of an individual is a different aim than the resilience of a social ecology? And what if a resilient social ecology is not made up of all resilient individuals?
Yeah, social ecology could be resilient by oppressing individuals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think sort of like a parallel analogy to that would be promoting the well-being of children. What if that doesn't make them very good adults? So it's like, it is a bit of a philosophical question that sort of, what are your aims in that? Is it a resilient organization, even at the expense of the functioning of the individuals that make it up?
It's probably not an important question to have asked, but I think of the stress and coping literature, and it was so confused for so long because people were using the word stress to refer to the things that happened to you, and also your response to those things. And it was such a powerful term, it got used for everything. It wasn't until people figured out where to apply it and where not that they made any progress.
Yeah, I think a lot could be said about that for the resilience models. There's so many people working on it from so many different angles, and that's kind of why that, I think it was Sunil Luthar who had that quote sort of about the heterogeneity being a strength, because they were getting a lot of criticism on like, whoa, what's your risk? Your risk is, it's over here it's poverty, and over here it's prematurity, and over here it's, an earthquake, and there's tons and tons of different conceptualizations. And so it does make it confusing. When I presented this paper, it kind of, anyone who's presented a paper knows at the end, it looks like, oh, and then we sat down and we decided now we're going to do this. Now it's going to be a person-centered analysis, and here are our domains. But in real life, it is crazy. There's like a million different variables you can look at. You have to decide, am I looking at one risk? Am I looking at socioeconomic status and how that relates to this and relates to that? And so her argument was that type of complexity was a strength of the theory or of the model or of the framework, rather than a detriment. That if it was too clean, then it wouldn't be as useful, because life is not clean. All right, we're all set? Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. You have such a supportive department.